Emily was a happy child. She had a bright smile that could light up any room, and her laughter was infectious. Her days were filled with joy and innocence, a world where everything seemed perfect and safe. She loved to play with her dolls and read her books. Her favorite stories were about brave heroes and magical lands where good always triumphed over evil. She would spend hours lost in these tales, her imagination running wild. Her parents loved her very much. They would often spend time together, playing games, reading stories, and sharing laughter. Emily felt secure and cherished in their warm embrace, knowing that she was the center of their world. But at night, Emily was scared. The darkness seemed to transform her familiar room into a place of unknown terrors. The comforting shapes of her toys and furniture turned into menacing silhouettes. She was scared of the dark. Every night when her parents turned off the lights, the shadows would creep in, filling her with dread. She would clutch her teddy bear tightly, seeking comfort in its soft fur. Every night when her parents turned off the lights, Emily would lie in bed and stare into the darkness. Her mind would race with thoughts of what could be hiding in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily would lie in bed and stare into the darkness. She would imagine all sorts of scary things lurking in the shadows, monsters with sharp teeth, ghosts with hollow eyes, and other creatures from her nightmares. One night, Emily saw something that made her heart stop. It was a shadow, a tall, dark shadow in the corner of her room. It seemed to move and shift as if it were alive. She would imagine all sorts of scary things lurking in the shadows. Her mind would conjure up images of creatures waiting to pounce, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The fear would grip her, making it hard to breathe. One night, Emily saw something that made her heart stop. It was a shadow, a tall, dark shadow in the corner of her room. It had no face, no features, just a long, thin, terrifying shape. A tall, dark shadow in the corner of her room. It seemed to grow larger and more menacing with each passing second. Emily's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It had no face, no features, just a long, thin, terrifying shape. It loomed over her, casting a dark pall over the room. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the faceless figure. Just a long, thin, terrifying shape. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if it were feeding off her fear. Emily's mind raced with thoughts of what it could be, but she couldn't come up with any answers. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would go away. She prayed for the morning light to chase away the darkness and the shadow with it. But when she opened her eyes again, the shadow was still there, watching her. But when she opened her eyes again, the shadow was still there, watching her. It seemed to be waiting for something, its presence filling the room with an oppressive silence. Emily's fear grew with each passing moment, and she wondered if she would ever feel safe again. Emily couldn't take her eyes off the shadow. It just stood there unmoving, but Emily felt like it was watching her, studying her. She wanted to scream for her parents, but she was too scared to make a sound. What if the shadow came closer? What if it hurt her? Emily pulled her blankets over her head. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to pretend the shadow wasn't there. But she could still feel its presence in the room, watching her, waiting. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep until the shadow was gone. The next morning, Emily told her parents about the shadow. She told them how scared she was, how it just stood there in the corner of her room, watching her. But her parents didn't believe her. They told her it was just a bad dream, that shadows couldn't hurt her. Emily tried to explain that it wasn't a dream, that the shadow was real, but her parents wouldn't listen. They told her to stop worrying and go play. Emily knew her parents didn't understand. They didn't see the shadow. They didn't know how real it was, and they didn't know how scared it made her. Section 4. Older but not bolder. As Emily got older, the shadow continued to appear in her room. Every night it would be there, standing in the corner, watching her. Emily's fear never went away. In fact, it only grew stronger over time. The shadow seemed to get closer every night, closer and closer to her bed. She told her friends about the shadow, but they just laughed at her. They said she was being silly, that there was no such thing as monsters in the closet, but Emily knew better. She knew the shadow was real, and she knew that one day it would finally reach her. Section 5. Closer and closer. One night, Emily woke up in a cold sweat. Her heart was racing and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She could feel the dampness of her sheets clinging to her skin, a stark reminder of the terror that had gripped her in her sleep. She had been having a nightmare so vivid and real that it felt like she was still trapped within its dark, suffocating grasp. A nightmare about the shadow. The same shadow that had haunted her dreams for weeks, always lurking in the periphery, always just out of reach. In her dream, it had finally reached her bed. She could feel its cold presence, an icy chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. It had leaned over her, and she could almost feel its breath, if it had any, on her face. The weight of its gaze was unbearable, pressing down on her like a physical force. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sounds. She looked around the room, her eyes searching the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner seemed to hide a lurking threat. At first she didn't see anything. The room was empty, or so it seemed. The silence was oppressive, the darkness almost tangible. And then she saw it, the shadow. It was there, just as it had been in her dream, a dark, menacing figure that seemed to absorb all light around it. It was standing right next to her bed, so close that she could almost reach out and touch it, though she dared not. Closer than it had ever been before. Its presence was overwhelming, a dark cloud that seemed to suffocate the very air around her. Emily gasped and scrambled back against her headboard. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It just stood there, its dark form looming over her, watching her. She could feel its eyes, or whatever it used to see, boring into her, stripping away her defenses, and then it did something it had never done before. It moved slowly and deliberately, as if savoring the moment. It reached out towards her. Its hand, if it could be called that, extended slowly, fingers stretching out like tendrils of darkness. Emily could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seemed to freeze her very soul. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but she was paralyzed with fear. The shadow's hand drew closer and closer until it was just inches from her face. She could feel the cold radiating from it, a cold that seemed to pierce her very being. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving Emily alone in the darkness, her heart still pounding in her chest. Section 6. Right beside me, Emily screamed. She screamed as loud as she could, but no sound came out. It was like the shadow was stealing her voice. The shadow's hand was getting closer, closer and closer to her face. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for it to touch her. But the touch never came. Emily slowly opened her eyes. The shadow was gone. The room was empty. Emily lay in bed, her body trembling. She knew the shadow would be back. It always came back. And next time she wasn't sure she would be able to escape. Section 7. No escape. Years passed. Emily grew up. She was no longer the little girl who used to play in the backyard, carefree and full of dreams. The innocence of her childhood had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of life. She moved out of her parents' house and into her own apartment. It was a new beginning, a chance to start fresh. She decorated her new space with hope and optimism, believing that this change would bring her peace. But the shadow followed her. It was a silent companion, always present, always watching. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, she could feel its presence. It was always there, lurking in the corners of her life. In the quiet moments when she was alone, she could sense it. It was as if the shadow was a part of her, an inseparable entity that she could never escape. In the shadows of her room at night, when the lights went out and the world was silent, the shadow would come alive. It would move across the walls, a dark, menacing presence that filled her with dread. In the dark alleys she walked down. Even in the bustling city, amidst the noise and chaos, the shadow was there. It followed her through the streets, a constant reminder that she was never truly alone, in the back of her mind, always watching her. It was a persistent thought, a nagging fear that she could never shake off. She would look over her shoulder, expecting to see it, but it was always just out of sight. Emily tried to move on with her life. She threw herself into her work, hoping to distract herself. She socialized with friends, trying to find solace in their company. But no matter what she did, the shadow was always there, a silent observer. She tried to forget about the shadow. She told herself it was just her imagination, a figment of her mind, but deep down she knew it was real. It was a part of her reality, a dark presence that she could never escape. But it was no use. It was always there, in the reflections of windows, in the mirrors, in the corners of her vision. It was a constant presence, a reminder of the terror that haunted her, a constant reminder of the terror that haunted her. It was a fear that she could never escape, a darkness that loomed over her life. No matter how much she tried to move on, the shadow was always there, a silent, menacing presence. Emily knew she would never be free from the shadow. It was a part of her, a dark entity that she could never escape. She had come to accept its presence, knowing that it would always be there, lurking in the shadows. It would follow her for the rest of her days, getting closer and closer. With each passing day, the shadow seemed to grow stronger, its presence more menacing. It was as if it was waiting for the right moment to strike, until the day it finally claimed her. Emily knew that one day the shadow would consume her. It was an inevitable fate, a dark destiny that she could never escape. And so she lived her life in the shadow's embrace, knowing that there was no escape from the darkness that haunted her.